The Secrets of Star Trek is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, episode 161.
Captain to bridge.
Spock here.
Make it so. Surrender is not an option.
Attention crew of the Enterprise, this is James Kirk.
We are all explorers, driven to know what's over the horizon, what's beyond our own shores.
We would have helped you get home if you had asked. That's who Starfleet is.
Hi, I'm Dom Bettinelli, and you're listening to The Secrets of Star Trek, where we discuss the hidden layers and deeper meanings found in all the Star Trek TV series, movies, and more. And today we're discussing the Star Trek movie Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. And joining me today on the panel is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
Poor Father Corey couldn't make it for this one. That's a loss for him, because this is I'm going to enjoy this one. Folks,
on the other hand, he got out of discussing dinosaurs on a spaceship on Doctor Who.
That's right, he did. It balances out. Folks, remember to like The Secrets of Star Trek on our Facebook page at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, and follow us on Twitter at SQPN and retweet the show there. And be sure to leave us comments and feedback. We'd love to hear from you. So let's talk about Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. This was as it says, the sixth Star Trek movie, the last movie that included the original crew as a whole, so it was set in that period. And it came out in December of 1991. Jimmy, can I ask you for a recap of the movie?
The Klingon moon Praxis explodes and dooms the homeworld to lose its breathable atmosphere within 50 years. In response, the Klingons and the Federation begin a peace initiative, and the Enterprise is sent to escort Klingon Chancellor Gorkon's ship to a peace conference on Earth. But everyone is extremely suspicious of each other as old hostilities die hard. En route to Earth, the Enterprise apparently attacks Gorkon's ship, and the Chancellor himself is assassinated. Kirk and McCoy try to save Gorkon's life, but they can't and are arrested and charged with his assassination. To get the peace conference back on track, the Federation must allow Kirk and McCoy to be put on trial, and they are sentenced to life imprisonment on the harsh penal asteroid Rurapente, though they are able to escape. Meanwhile, aboard the Enterprise, Spock and the crew discover that the attack leading to Gorkon's death was the product of a conspiracy that is determined to keep the peace conference from succeeding. The conspiracy involves members who are human, Klingon, and Romulan. In its efforts to thwart the peace initiative, the conspiracy will certainly attempt another assassination, this time killing the president of the Federation. Consequently, the Enterprise, together with Captain Sulu's Excelsior, fly to Camp Khitomer, where they stop the assassination at the last moment and expose the conspiracy, saving the day and ensuring peace.
So I want to talk a little bit first about the behind-the-scenes aspects, because there's a lot that happened.
Yeah, me too.
behind the scenes of the making of this movie. It was a tumultuous time at Paramount, and in the Star Trek production milieu. But one thing, Gene Roddenberry was not directly involved in the making of this movie. And in fact...
Yeah, after the first movie, which he was involved in, they kicked him upstairs, so he couldn't directly influence the movies anymore. He could only complain.
Right. And in fact, at one point, who is it? Nicholas Myers, who was
Meyer.
Meyer, who is the director, got into a yelling match with him and told him off. And sadly, Roddenberry died before the movie came out, and then they dedicated it to him. And I know Meyer felt bad afterward.
He did see it 2 days before he died. And he gave them thumbs up upon seeing it, and then immediately called his lawyer, Leonard Magelis, and said he wanted to get 15 minutes of the movie cut out that he thought was too militaristic. And then he died 2 days later before Magelis could file the motions.
Interesting. So, yeah, there was a lot of back and forth over what the movie should be. Part of it because Final Frontier, Star Trek V, was so bad and flopped so bad that they almost didn't make this movie. And when they finally got permission, the studio said, you can make this movie, but not for $1 more budget than we spent on Final Frontier. And Meyer and Leonard Nimoy, who he brought in to help write the story, were saying there's no way we could do that at that budget. And they ended up going a little higher, but having to cut out a whole bunch of stuff that they wanted to do. They did this whole prelude of with the crew had moved on into their new lives post Starfleet, and then being brought back together and all that sort of stuff, and that all that got cut. So there was a whole lot of stuff in the
Frankly,
background.
I think I don't mind that. I think the movie is tight enough as it is. I don't need to see what they were all doing. I mean, Scotty mentions he just bought a boat. I don't need a 2-minute scene showing me on him on the boat to slow down the beginning of the movie.
Right. I don't need to see Uhura as a radio show host. I think is what she was going to be.
No, she was hosting a seminar at Starfleet Academy on communications or something.
Well, that's what made it into the movie. But in the cut sequence, she was going to be a radio show host or something, which was
okay.
Which I guess in the 23rd century should be a podcaster.
Yeah.
So. And then there's all kinds of studio politics. You can read all about it online. I don't necessarily want to get into all the back and forth, but it was like a revolving door of studio executives that overseeing it.
They also had different premises. I think it was Harve Bennett wanted to finally pull the trigger on the Starfleet Academy idea, so they could recast a younger group to continue making movies with this as the final regular appearance of the main cast. But that idea went over badly, and so they didn't make that. Walter Koenig had an idea called In Flanders Fields, where they bring back where they have transition to a new crew, and the new crew under the command of Spock, I think, gets into trouble, and they've got to bring back the old crew to save them, and all of the old crew except Spock dies.
Oh, wow.
And so they didn't make that one either. I'm glad they didn't.
Yeah.
Because what they did make is, to my mind, the best Star Trek movie that has been made to date.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. I accept the rule for the pre-JJ movies of all the odd ones are either bad or less good, and all the even ones are good.
Yep.
So 2, 4, and 6 are good. 1, 3, and 5 are either bad, or in the case of 3, not as good.
Yes.
But I would still kind of on the. I mean, it's still a definite downgrade in quality.
Right.
2, 4, and 6 are different genres. 2 is a popcorn revenge play. 4 is a broad audience comedy romp.
Yep.
And 6 is an intelligent political thriller mystery.
Yes.
And 2 is Nicholas Meyer. 4 is Leonard Nimoy, and 6 is Leonard Nimoy and Nicholas Meyer.
Right.
So you notice there's some commonalities there.
Yes.
It was, in fact, Leonard Nimoy that came up with the premise for 6. He was talking about different possibilities, and as they were... Now, you have to look at this movie in its time.
Yes.
And one of the things that you may not, if you're young enough, you may not appreciate everything about this movie that I do or that others would, because we're old enough to remember this period in history.
1991.
This movie very much reflects the period in which it was made. We had been in a Cold War with the Russians since 1945. And we grew up, people of my age, with the threat of nuclear war happening unexpectedly at any minute and ending life on Earth, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what it felt like. We were living under a constant existential threat. Now, you didn't think about that every moment or you would go crazy. Some people did go crazy.
Yes.
But it was always there in the background. And so then in the 60s, Star Trek took that and used the Klingons as a cipher for the Russians. Well, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was heading towards economic collapse, and they were having a leadership crisis, and we came close to nuclear war, and then they had Chernobyl, a nuclear power plant, blow up in 1986 and cause a massive disaster that certainly didn't help them. And then in 1989, the satellite states in the Warsaw Pact that the Soviet Union had created as a buffer between itself and the Western powers. These were states like Poland, Yugoslavia, East Germany, and so forth, began rebelling. And it starting with protests and lack of cooperation and stuff like that. And kind of the symbol of the East-West divide. Now, Winston Churchill had, when the Warsaw Pact formed, characterized this by saying an iron curtain has descended around Eastern Europe and partitioned the West from the Soviet Empire. And so Iron Curtain was a big phrase at the time. And the Iron Curtain was kind of physicalized by a big wall that they had built through the middle of Berlin in Germany, because originally, after World War II, the Western powers had control of the western parts of Germany and Berlin, and the Soviets had control of the eastern part of Germany and the eastern part of the capital city, Berlin. And so you got West Germany as one nation and East Germany as another nation with a divided capital in the middle. But needless to say, people didn't like living under Soviet tyranny in the East, and they would try to escape to the West. And to prevent that, the Soviets built a wall down the middle of Berlin called the Berlin Wall to keep their people in so they couldn't leave for the West. And it was very dangerous. They would shoot people who would try to get over the wall, and it was a very tense situation. It was kind of the neutral zone between us and them. And so in 1989, the protests got to be enough that people just decided to ignore the regulations about the wall, and they started tearing it down. And so very quickly thereafter, East Germany and West Germany were reunited to become just Germany again. And that, the fact the Soviets were weak enough to allow that, gave hope to other nations that were part of the Soviet Empire. And so like the Baltic states, like Latvia and others, decided, hey, we're not Russian ethnically. We don't have to continue to be part of the Soviet Union. Let's demand our independence. And the leader at the time in the Soviet Union, a man named Gorbachev, was reform-minded enough and weak politically enough to allow this to happen. And so the Soviet Union started falling apart. And, I mean, not just losing its satellite states in the Warsaw Pact, but the Soviet Union itself started dissolving. And so this did not go without reprisal, because there were people in the Soviet Union who didn't want this to happen. And so in August of 1991, there was a coup from military forces in the Soviet Union, and they they didn't kill Gorbachev. They shipped him off to exile internally. He was staying at his dacha, his summer home, and wasn't allowed to leave. Right. But then the coup failed because the reformers in the Soviet Union said, we're not going to comply with this. They were led by a man named Boris Yeltsin. And by December of 1991, things had progressed to the point that the Soviet Union dissolved completely, and it became the Commonwealth of Independent States, and Boris Yeltsin became the leader, and it ushered in a new post-Cold War age. But lots of people here in the West were really split about this. On the one hand, it looked great, it sounded great, and a lot of people were saying, hey, we can now ratchet down and mothball a bunch of our defenses.
The peace dividend.
And we can have this peace dividend, since we won't have to be spending money on as much military might now. On the other hand, other people were saying, the Soviets have violated every treaty they've ever signed. You cannot trust these people. This is some kind of ploy. Or even if they're sincere right now, it's going to recrudesce into some kind of new Soviet empire, and we're going to get caught with our pants down. So you had all of this tension here in the West, and obviously tension over there. The fall of the Soviet Union was so dramatic. Now, at the time, they had a space station called Mir, which is Russian for peace. And there were astronauts who had left from the Soviet Union and returned to Earth to the Commonwealth of Independent States. Their nation fell apart while they were up on this temporary mission.
Right.
So this was a very dramatic time, and we all lived through this. And Leonard Nimoy, in talking to Nicholas Meyer, said, what if the wall comes down in space?
Right.
What if we see the beginning of the Federation and the Klingons making peace? And Nicholas Meyer seized on that and said, I know how to do that. And that was the genesis of this movie.
And what's interesting is the movie was made before the events of August 91. I mean, obviously, the movie came out in December of 91, but that made it so dramatic because the movie came out as the Soviet Union was going through this nuclear superpower was having a revolution, which it was, I remember being very scary at the time.
Yeah. And now some things had already happened, like when Praxis explodes at the very beginning of the movie, that's the analog of Chernobyl.
Chernobyl, right.
Gorkon is the analog of Michael Gorbachev.
Yeah, Gorkon, Gorbachev. Very clear.
Yeah. And then we did start having these peace feelers going out between the Western powers, between NATO, led by the U.S., and the Soviet Warsaw Pact.
Mm-hmm.
So those analogs are clear. But then while this movie is in the theaters in December of 91, that's when the Soviet Union actually falls apart.
Right.
I mean, it was so contemporary. Now, a lot of that, looking back, I didn't remember the exact timing of how the film, related to the political events. I looked that up. But still, there was so much of this happening contemporaneously. This was very meaningful. And even with now 30 years of distance, because this is the 30th anniversary of this movie, the 30th anniversary year, and I haven't seen this movie in years, but it is just, to my mind, it is the best of all of them. Now, that doesn't mean I would watch it over 2 or 4 constantly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, sometimes I want comedy and I'll watch 4, and sometimes I'm in for a kind of cheesy popcorn revenge play, and 2 is great. But in terms of the thinking man Star Trek, this is crafted on the writing level. Even if you don't know all the history, on the writing level, this is crafted better than anything else.
Yeah. I've always been a Wrath of Khan man myself, but I really love this movie. I really do. This is, my second favorite of them.
Mm-hmm.
I still hold Wrath of Khan, I think, as an emotional thing, but I really enjoyed this movie because of those elements, because it's a sophisticated story, and it just there's some really great moments in this story as well.
I also partially wanted to explain how the times, in part because people may be today looking at the characters and going, wow, they're kind of really harsh in their distrust of the Klingons.
Right.
But no. You've got years and years and years of TNG and DS9 and Voyager in your head where the Klingons can be friends.
Right.
That was not the case in the TOS era.
Right.
In the TOS era, they were opponents. And people in 1991 were extremely torn about, could we be friends with the Soviets after all this time or not? I mean, we all wanted to, but there was lots of suspicion. And so actually, if you think about Kirk and the gang in terms of their era where the Klingons were nothing but villains, this actually makes sense.
Right. And this was, came out around the 6th season of TNG. So there've been a lot of TNG already. And it puts into canon the events of, because we'd already heard about the Khitomer Accords early on in TNG. And this gives us that story of how did the Klingons in the Federation become friends.
And you know what that means, Dom? You can totally write a kick-butt prequel.
Right.
Because that's what this is.
Yes, this is a prequel to TNG, essentially.
Yeah, there's not a problem with prequels. There's a problem with people not knowing how to write them. This was written well.
Right. Well, it doesn't come across as a total prequel. Like we're giving you the whole story.
Well, they're not doing the check boxes to tell you
exactly
where the dice on the Millennium Falcon came from, as if anybody cared about that.
Right, exactly. So yeah, this is how prequels should be done.
Also, I would note, of all the Star Trek movies, this is the closest to Deep Space Nine in its feel.
Yep.
And that's another reason that this is my favorite movie, because it is the closest. It pushes the same buttons that Deep Space Nine pushes.
So the cast, I want to mention the cast. So we have David Warner, who plays Gorkon. David Warner, it doesn't have a very long time as he dies in the first act, but he's
memorable.
He's memorable. He's an interesting. He's very different from what we'll see later when we see Gowron as Chancellor. He's a different kind of Klingon politician, shall we say, Klingon leader.
Mm-hmm.
He's not quite so I am a warrior sort of person, and that was interesting. We also have Captain Von Trapp as General Chang. I think he's one of my favorite things of this movie. The Shakespeare quoting Klingon General Chang. It's awesome.
And that is one where my mileage differs a little. I would cite as a writing flaw, I think he quotes Shakespeare too much.
I agree. I think he does.
They even hang a lantern on that at one moment where he's ranting Shakespeare over the comm, and McCoy is like, I'd give real money if he would shut up.
Yes. Actually, McCoy has a lot of good lines in this one. They give him a lot of funny lines.
Well, actually, the whole staff, in some movies, they have trouble figuring out what to do with the different crew members because the crew members the actors are not going to show up if they're not given something to do. They don't want to just show up and say, hailing frequencies open, Captain. But in most movies, in many of them, certainly in the odd-numbered ones, the plot is so thin that they don't have anything for them to do, leading to regrettable moments like the Uhura naked fan dance in Star Trek V.
It was so terrible.
Just to give Nichelle Nichols something to do.
Right.
But in this movie, the plot is tightly wound, and that results in all of them getting good stuff to do.
Yeah, that's true. And then I should also mention Kim Cattrall as Valeris. There was a whole thing in this where it was going to be Saavik who played this part.
Yep.
But they wanted Kirstie Alley back for it, and she wasn't coming. And there's all kinds of questions about why.
In addition, I mean, you didn't have to have Kirstie Alley back because Saavik had been played by more than one actor. You could have had Robin, whatever her name was.
And for some reason, she apparently was never considered, which is a shame.
But Nicholas Meyer, who created the Saavik character, wanted Saavik to be the traitor, which is what Valeris is.
Yeah.
And Gene Roddenberry objected strenuously, saying Saavik had become this beloved character. She was a part of the crew now. The fans had accepted her. He didn't want her being the traitor. And Nicholas Meyer was like, I created her. I can make her the traitor if I want. But eventually he didn't. And actually that is one that I can see both points of view, because I remember these movies when they came out, and Saavik genuinely was warmly accepted by the fans. And having her turn out to be the traitor would have been a little bit like Geordie LaForge turning out to be a traitor, in the third season of Next Gen or something,
Right.
because she'd been around for years. I mean, even though it wasn't that many movies, there are years between movies, and there had been years of novels and stuff. And the fans really had accepted Saavik as part of the family, even though she wasn't in the original series. And so I can kind of see that. And I really like Kim Cattrall as Valeris. I think she's a good character.
I think she did a pretty good job. Yeah, I did. I wasn't sad that Valeris was in there and Kim Cattrall was playing her. One other interesting character note is that, I was going to say Renee Auberjonois, who plays Odo in DS9, was in this as a Starfleet Marine, Colonel West.
Yeah, who is the assassin at the end, but he's only in the director's cut. His scene, his part was small enough that it wasn't in the theatrically released version, so you may or may not see Renee Auberjonois, although he does get a great line early on in a briefing to the president of the Federation. They're talking about, it's before Kirk and McCoy's trial, and he's talking about this rescue operation that they're planning to go get him, which the president does not approve. But the president at one point says, well, what if this rescue effort leads to a full-scale war? And Renee Auberjonois, as Colonel West, gets to say, well, then, quite frankly, sir, we'll clean their chronometers.
Yes, it's overly complex.
But we also have Brock Peters as Admiral Cartwright, who's one of the conspirators, and he's familiar as Ben Sisko's dad.
Right. And also was previously Admiral Cartwright in the two previous movies as well.
Yeah.
But yes, Ben Sisko's dad.
But like when he's ranting grumpily about the Klingons, in this movie, I can't help wanting to mentally splice in dialogue about the state of the gumbo in the kitchen. And
right. So I want to mention an angle that Gene Roddenberry was unhappy with, and this is he was unhappy with the perceived racism toward Klingons. And in fact, there were a couple of lines that had to be, one was transferred from one character to another, one was sort of said off screen, like I think it was probably said in ADR, the in the dialogue relooping.
Well, there were two that Nichelle Nichols refused to say.
Right. There's one where it's the "Would you let your daughter marry one?"
Mm-hmm.
And then the other line was "Guess who's coming to dinner?"
Right.
Which was a reference to the movie "Guess Who's Coming to Dinner," starring
Sidney Poitier and
yes.
other what's
his name?
Their faces are in my head, but yeah.
Yes.
Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was a story, a movie, the first major movie to deal with an interracial marriage.
Right.
And it involved Sidney Poitier, who's a black actor, being brought over to meet the parents of his fiancée in a white family.
Right. And you could see
Spencer Tracy and,
yes.
And what's their name?
Katharine Hepburn?
Yeah, Katharine Hepburn, and then there's the fiancé as well.
Oh, that one, I knew the other two, but I didn't know that one. Yeah. But in any case, Nichelle Nichols was uncomfortable with this being the voice of the racist person in the I get that.
I get that, but I also think it's a missed opportunity because it's the easy thing to do as an actor is say, this conflicts with my personal values, so I'm not going to do it. The harder thing to do is to recognize that human nature is flawed, and it is realistic that even after our present problems subside, human nature will remain the same and can reappear in new forms in the future if we aren't careful. And so actually displaying the kind of what you could consider a racist sentiment towards non-humans, even after humans have patched up their differences, we're still going to have the same nature. And so there is the potential for, if you want to consider racism a form of othering or extreme othering, that potential to other people or other species is still going to be there. And so it would have been, to my mind, art to have someone for whom the human history has receded so much that this same thing can manifest towards others without immediately framing it in a historical human context.
Right.
There's something elevating about that as a warning, and that this same thing can happen in the future, even once we've forgotten our historical differences, because that happens all the time already on Earth. It used to be here in America a big deal if you were Irish or Italian American, and it's like there were signs put up, no Irish need apply, and things like that. And nobody cares about that anymore. But there can still be animus towards outgroups. It's just the outgroups change. And similarly, nobody cares in Europe, or here in America anyway, about which tribe of Goths somebody was a member of 1,000 years ago.
Right.
But still, this is a recurrent problem. And so I think it's entirely legitimate people are always praising Star Trek, I think, somewhat misguidededly, for playing cautionary tales about contemporary problems. Well, if you're going to do that, play it.
Right. Although I do think putting that second line, "Guess who's coming to dinner," in Chekhov's mouth, the Russian accent, I think actually it plays well in what we were talking about, the political aspect, the political atmosphere of the time. Yeah,
Yeah,
I liked
okay.
having Chekhov say that. The other line, which was Brock Peters was uncomfortable with in the Starfleet Council chamber, the line where he said we need to bring them to their knees, which he felt like brought about the ideas of slavery. I don't think that's as
that's
obvious?
because that was a line in another movie where that line, we bring them to their knees, was applied in some way to African Americans.
Oh, okay, I didn't catch that reference.
So that was an intertextual reference.
Okay.
There was also another line which William Shatner was unhappy with the way Nicholas Meyer handled it. It's in the initial briefing scene where after the meeting is broken up and they've been assigned to take the Enterprise to be an escort, Spock is alone with Kirk, and Spock is saying if we don't help them, they're going to die. And Kirk heatedly says, because he's thinking about his son David, Kirk heatedly says, "Let them die," and he's really adamant about it.
Right.
And he in the performance, he did a take where he said the line, but then did a dismissive hand move to take the edge off of it.
Like
to
he kind of
indicate
regrets
he's not,
saying it. Yeah.
Yeah, or like he's not fully serious about it. And Nicholas Meyer promised him that would stay in, and it didn't.
Yeah.
So he comes across as just coldly, "Let them die."
Yeah. And that's a bit out of character for Kirk, and that characterization.
It is, even though they killed his son. And by the way, notice, we meet his son David in Star Trek II.
No, Rathacon, right?
Right.
Yep.
And then he dies in Star Trek III, which undoes all of the stuff they achieved in Star Trek II.
Yep.
Which is a mistake. You don't create the Genesis device and then immediately you can't use it forever again because it's broken.
Right.
And you introduce David and immediately he's dead. And you introduce Carol Marcus and immediately she's gone. And just Spock dies and immediately he's back. That's the one thing they should have done. They shouldn't have undone all this other stuff. But just like when so that was a poor character death from a writing perspective. Just like Tasha Yar was a poor character death in Next Gen that they then redeemed with yesterday's Enterprise. Well, here, even though killing David in Episode 3 was bad, using his death as a motive for Kirk's mistrust of the Klingons and as a plot point here, where a tape recording of his log where he's talking about, "I can never trust Klingons because they killed my son," that is, again, redemptive. Not in the same way as the redemption of Tasha Yar's death, but it still shows how even when there have been writing mistakes made in the past, you can use them constructively.
Right. Should mention that Merritt Buttrick, who played David Marcus in Star Trek 2 and 3, died in 1989. So he was it was a bit of a posthumous honor.
Wait,
he put his picture
played him
there.
in both, did he? I thought there was a shift of actors.
No, the only shift in that was Saavik. He was in both.
Okay.
Yeah. So, speaking of that Federation Council scene, there is a great line from Spock there, because he's the one who introduces the idea of this peace plan, and kind of shanghais Kirk and the old crew into it. That's probably an inappropriate term these days, I guess. But he ropes them in, sort of without consulting with them, which is a bit of a bad form. But at one point he says, there's an old Vulcan proverb, "Only Nixon could go to China." Which
is great.
Yeah, I like that one.
This film also later on has the even better line, "As one of my ancestors said, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth," which is Sherlock Holmes' famous saying.
So therefore, Spock is descended on his mother's side, apparently, from Sherlock Holmes.
Or Conan Doyle.
Yeah, or Conan Doyle. Now, this whole thing of Praxis exploding, which is a Chernobyl reference, I think we agree on that.
Nicholas Meyer said so.
Yeah. It's also similar to the Picard series story of the Romulan Empire falling apart, being destroyed by a similar cataclysmic event. I feel like...
And in both cases, the science doesn't work.
Right.
I mean, even if the Romulan star went supernova, it would not bring down their empire. It would bring down one solar system.
Yes, they would just move the capital.
And similarly here, even if Praxis is in orbit around Kronos,
Yep.
then it wouldn't cause Kronos' atmosphere to be depleted over 50 years' time. That makes no sense. It would either immediately slam huge amounts of particulate matter and meteors into Kronos, kicking up vast amounts of... I mean, it would be a dinosaur-level extinction event.
Yeah.
Immediately. It wouldn't take 50 years. And it wouldn't bring down their entire empire.
Right. They said it's their primary energy production facility for an entire empire of many planets. A civilization that has antimatter engines running their ships.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. But it's whatever. But
when Praxis blows up, we get treated to another ridiculously thin two-dimensional shockwave that ships just happen to be in, instead of blowing up the way stars really do, which is in 3 dimensions and in all directions.
Right. And the shockwave travels like the movies. It always bugs me. The movies do a bad job compared to the TV shows for some reason of dealing with the distance in space and the time it takes to cover distance. Everything is within about a half-hour travel and about 50 miles apart.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Another example of that is later when they're on Rura Penthe, and Kirk tells McCoy that I've got a Viridium patch on the back of my costume, which I've been wearing this whole time, and they didn't take away from me, even though we're on a prison colony.
Yep.
Because Spock put it there right before we beamed over to the Klingon ship, and he should be able to detect me two sectors away. Well, a sector is clearly a measure of interstellar distance in this show. And that would mean that if Spock can pinpoint where Kirk is right now, which he can, because we see him doing that from space, from way far away, even from across the Klingon neutral zone.
Yep.
Viridium must be radiating particles much faster than light.
Yeah.
Otherwise, Spock's going to wait years to find out where Kirk was years ago.
Right. They travel through a wormhole. Yeah,
like this Viridium is apparently emitting tachyon radiation.
Yeah, and killing Kirk in the process. Yeah, that whole the Viridium patch thing was like, I can see it. Why don't the Klingons see this thing?
Yeah.
It must be visible to Klingons' visual spectrum.
I'm willing to give it to this movie though, just because the rest of the movie is so much fun.
Yeah, but do you feel like going back to this idea of the enemy empire falling due to a cataclysmic event? Going back to that in Picard, was that sort of a cheat?
Well, I don't mind particularly. I mean, the way they got... I would do it differently.
Yeah.
The way they got there, though, was organic.
Mm-hmm.
So they decided in Next Gen that they wanted the Klingons to be good guys, that they wanted to show progress. And they did. And so that was fine. And then they did this as a prequel to show us how it happened. And that was fine.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have the part 1 and part 2 of unification in Next Gen again, with Spock coming back. And this time Spock, and this is another kind of interesting layering of the writing, Spock says, the reason I came to Romulus myself is because previously, when I was trying to do negotiation between the Federation and the Klingons, I involved other people like Kirk and McCoy, and they suffered as a result, and I felt responsible, so I didn't want to do the same thing now. I didn't want my cowboy diplomacy to have repercussions for other people if it wasn't going to work.
Right.
And so that all felt, and since the Romulans and Vulcans are, genetically related, there'd always been this question of can they reunite at some point.
Yeah.
And so that was logical. It grew organically. I would have handled how we get to this point differently, because a single supernova is not going to, it will be detected way in advance.
Right.
And you can evacuate your planet way in advance, and it shouldn't bring down an interstellar civilization. So I would have done that differently, but I don't mind them revisiting it.
Yeah, I get that they want that sense of urgency. They want a cataclysmic event that causes them to come to the table and have no choice, and it gives a sense of urgency to the whole thing. But yeah, I would have preferred that they did it a little differently.
At least they kicked it up to a star instead of just a moon this time.
Yes. I have a note here where I just want to say my favorite Star. I know you're not big on Star Trek ships or ships, science fiction ships. I love science fiction ships, and the NCC 1701A Enterprise is still my very favorite Star Trek ship. I love her lines. I would love to see that ship fly all the time. I was so I just wanted to say that here, and it's the last time we get to see her fly in a movie. So so there's that. It's interesting. Spock has a copy of Chagall's Adam and Eve painting, Adam and Eve Expelled from Paradise, in his quarters. He says to remind him that all things end. So just get an idea of at least one of the four last things.
Also, in that same scene where he's talking to Saavik in his quarters, Valeris, sorry. Where he's talking to Valeris in his quarters, and they're doing some kind of ritual that involves some kind of Vulcan ritual, which they never explain. They're just doing it, and it's kind of nice to see that as an element in their culture, even though they don't explain it. I mean, in fact, it's kind of nice they don't explain it.
Yeah.
Because as Vulcans, they would just be taking it for granted. We're doing the so-and-so ceremony now.
Mm-hmm.
But they're like Spock is making some kind of tea or something, and then they both drink from the same cup. And he's talking to her about how he means for her to succeed him on the ship. And she says, I could never succeed you, I could only replace you, which is a great lines from both of them.
Right.
But then he's also talking to her about having faith that the universe will unfold as it should. And this is something that he has come to over a long period of time. Because at the beginning, at least after the pilot of the original series, Spock is logic. But by the time we hit the movies, he's opened up to this faith dimension as well.
Mm-hmm.
And he's trying to get her to appreciate that, where she's still at the beginning of her Vulcan journey, and she's just logic. And he then tells her, logic is the beginning of wisdom, but not the end. And I'm a little perplexed by that line and the intent behind it, because the beginning of wisdom, anything that has that in it is a biblical reference to where Proverbs says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And here Spock has replaced the fear of the Lord with logic, and you could think, okay, this is some kind of secular anti-religious edit, except he's doing it in the service of having faith.
Right.
So it's interestingly paradoxical in that way.
Yeah. And speaking of that ceremony, some have taken this scene to suggest that there was more between Spock and Valeris than just a mentorship relationship, that there might have been more like a romantic, whatever Vulcans call romantic relationship of some sort. But I don't think it's borne out.
I didn't take it that way.
Yeah, I don't think the text, the movie itself gives us that. I think it's just a mentorship.
It portrays it as mentorship explicitly.
Yeah. So let's talk about the dinner scene, because the dinner scene is actually kind of great. Valeris, as the bad guy, the mole among the crew, she maneuvers them to have, hey, Captain, there's some Romulan ale on board. That should make things go well. And of course, the Romulan ale undermines everything, makes them all a little too free with their opinions of each other, and really messes things up. And this is where we get Chang quoting Shakespeare and saying, you've not experienced Shakespeare until you've read him in the original Klingon, which, by the way, has left a lot of fans who have since translated the entire works of Shakespeare into Klingon. So, but then we get this back and forth. There's one point where Chang says, we need breathing room. And Kirk says, Earth, Hitler, 1938. They have this back and forth of these lines, and it's like,
that was a little forced, because the Klingons already have breathing room. The problem is their core planet now has a problem. So that was kind of, I can appreciate that they would want to include, that they would want to fulfill, Godwin's law and get a Hitler reference in there.
Yep.
But I don't think they set it up adequately given what's been established.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, that was sort of a reference to previously where Gorkon says the undiscovered country and Spock says Hamlet.
So the title of the movie is also a Shakespeare problem, because in Hamlet, Act 3, Scene 1, the undiscovered country is not the future. The undiscovered country is death, from which no traveler returns. So we've got an abused Shakespeare line, but I like the rest of the movie so much I'm willing to overlook that.
Yeah.
Also, we have a line that I always found a little bit cringeworthy in the dinner scene where Chekhov is talking about everybody deserves inalienable human rights. And Azit Burr, the daughter of the chancellor, immediately calls him on it and says, inalienable human rights. The very term is racist. Well, okay, that's kind of problematic for a couple of reasons. Number one, inalienable has nothing to do with aliens.
Yeah.
Inalienable means you cannot take it or give it away.
Right.
And so it just happens to sound like the word alien, but it has nothing to do with aliens. Secondly, human rights people did and were in the 1980s and 90s in the context of the Soviet Union talking about they violate people's inalienable human rights over there. So that was part of the language of the day, and I can give it a little bit of a pass on that basis because it was what the audience was familiar with, but human rights should not be a term in the 23rd century.
Right.
It should be something else, sentient rights or something.
And having Chekhov say that, it was sort of it was lazy writing because Chekhov wouldn't say it, but we need him to be called on it by Azit Burr, so we're going to have him say it. Yeah. And
she then she then teases out the implications, or one of the Klingons then teases out the implication. The Federation is basically a humans-only club with some exceptions.
Right. Which
is not really true.
Yeah. Right. I mean, it's been well established that the Federation is many more than just humans, but yeah, that was tricky.
I do like after the dinner scene, and actually the post-dinner scene where the Klingons beam back over to their ship, I like.
Yep.
Because Gorkon turns to Kirk and says, if there is to be a brave new world, our generation is going to have the hardest time living in it.
Yes.
And that's a good line. And then as they beam out, all of the Enterprise crew visibly relaxes. And just in unison, okay, they're gone. We can relax now. And they're all, and McCoy's like, I'm going to get some coffee. And Kirk is, I'm going to sleep this off. And
yes.
They're all talking about what they're going to do now that the Klingons are finally gone and the horrible dinner party is over, which is my personal reaction after the end of every social function I have to attend that's not a dance.
There is an interesting, Uhura and Chekhov note the terrible table manners of the Klingons, and Spock kind of chides them a little bit. I doubt that our own behavior will distinguish us in the annals of diplomacy. He's critical of them.
And this is another bit of othering that it's like, okay, even on Earth, we have widely different table manners.
Yeah.
If you go to Indonesia, people are going to eat almost everything with their fingers. Right. And that's fine. That's just their way of doing it. Whereas you go farther north in Asia, they're going to be using chopsticks. You go to the West, they're going to be using spoons and forks.
Right.
Oh, in some cultures, you're going to have open mouth lip smacking as a sign of appreciation. In others, that's considered rude.
Yeah.
Already, realistically in the 23rd century, they should already not care about the table manners, really.
Right. And that's where we're going to have to stop our discussion for today. We have lots more to say about Star Trek VI, but that'll have to wait until our next episode. Until then, we'd like to thank our patrons who make it possible for us to create the Secrets of Star Trek, including Michael C., Joseph O., Jason L., Keith M., and William M. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue the Secrets of Star Trek and all the shows at StarQuest. You can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. We'd also like to thank Victor Lambs, who edits the show for us every week. Folks, send us your feedback at sqpn.com/trek or our Facebook page at facebook.com/StarQuestMedia, or send an email to trek@sqpn.com. We'll be back next time for the conclusion of our discussion of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Until then, Jimmy Akin, thank you for joining me and sharing the secrets of Star Trek.
Thank you, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to the Secrets of Star Trek on StarQuest, and remember, you've not experienced Shakespeare until you've read him in the original Klingon. Qapla'!